If you look at sort of medium, long-term, global trade is doing well. Trade is roughly more open than it was before, although since Donald Trump was elected president of the US, he has quite dramatically changed the US trade policy. So medium and long term, global trade is doing well, is growing, interdependence of production systems of goods, services, financial flows, movement of people is increasing, but we have a short-term problem given this new US stance. Too soon to say whether it's a parenthesis, whether it's a bad moment we have to live through, or whether it will result in a change of paradigm. That's probably too soon to say, but it clearly is a rupture as compared to a long-term trend of increasing trade and globalization. But the main dimension seen from where we are, we Europeans, is Sino-US rivalry. There are reasons why Trump was elected, which have to do with the US economic and social system, who probably left over too many people, who then vented a sort of frustration, anger, which Donald Trump very cleverly engineered. So there are roots which have to do with economic and social pain in the US, and trade opening is part of that, which led him to be elected on a sort of protectionist platform. This is on top of a trend of tensions between US and China, which had been reasonably contained in previous US administrations and by previous generations of Chinese leaderships. I think what has changed is that on the one side, the US have gone sort of more aggressive, moving from a sort of policy which was about containing China to a policy which is about pushing back China, which is something which is different. And I think on the Chinese side, it's also probable that the Chinese leadership has turned sort of more affirmative, that the China model was on offer for the rest of the world. So these two things coexist. And I think at the end of the day, the big question, at least for us Europeans, is whether this Sino-US rivalry will remain contained, and if it's about a bit of a trade war, or whether this tension will rise. Inescapable that this rebalancing of power on this planet between US and China will create turbulences. It's always been the case in history. Previously, most of these rebalancing led to quite dramatic development worldwide, like wars. Not this time, and I personally believe that we've reached a stage of globalization which allows to contain these tensions, although if the US really would want to deglobalize, then the situation would become more dangerous, both on the US side and on the Chinese side, if the purpose is to disentangle US and China economically, technologically, politically, and there may be camps on both sides that have this option in mind, which I think is a worry. My advice to the US is that the world is a better place with a China which is open and not closed. This sort of aggressiveness vis-à-vis China has a risk, which is reinforcing on the Chinese side the part of the leadership within the Politburo that believes, and probably has always believed, that China has gone too far in opening, in trusting these long noses. I think this is dangerous. which is why I would advise to keep the sort of previous policy, which was to try and bring China as a major responsible stakeholder of the global world we live in, rather than cornering China in a way that probably could make it more dangerous. My advice to China is try and keep the balance which has been there for the last 30 years, where the forces of openness have been bigger than the forces of closeness. China is a huge country, and its history has seen shifts from closing to opening, which are understandable given the size of the country. In many ways, the Chinese people may believe they have the option of being more or less closed, which Botswana or Sweden or Singapore or Chile do not have. I believe the US stance, which again is originated in the view that China is a danger for the US, that the rise of China and the demise of US is a problem, I would try and give signals to the rest of the world, including to the US, that China's rise is something that can be run peacefully, and there's nothing like intentions, like, for instance, stealing intellectual property, which, as you know, are sometimes quite high in headlines. I think EU, and by the way Japan, have roughly aligned interests in keeping both sides in contact. And that's, by the way, on the trade side, which is only one of the many areas of these very complex relationships. That's what EU is trying to do. I mean, EU is talking to US on the one side, talking to China on the other side, is tabling proposals in WTO, some of which are co-sponsored with US, some of which are co-sponsored with China, so that at the end of the day, this sort of triangle EU, US, China works. The problem being that we need the third bit of the triangle, which is US-China, to work also. And I think for the moment, that's the right attitude, keeping somewhere in the middle, while recognizing that the European civilization is quite different from the US one, or from the Chinese one, and that it's a question of organizing coexistence. I mean, Europeans roughly know how to do that within Europe, which I think is a good experience. So making it work on a larger world scene may be a reasonable ambition for Europe. Well, I think WTO minus US is only plan B. We first have to work on plan A, which is keeping US within the WTO tent, which implies a number of changes in order to address some of the criticisms the US has vis-à-vis WTO, and some of them, in my view, are reasonable. Some of them are excessive, but some of them are reasonable, and that's the sort of plan A. Now, if that doesn't work, or if the US put conditions sort of my way or no way, others than the US in the WTO have to realize that, you know, you cannot negotiate with a knife on your throat. So making sure that the negotiating game remains balanced and is not captured by the US implies that another option is studied, that another option is on the table. Again, not that it's the preferred one, but if you want to plan A to succeed, you sometimes need a plan B. Well, it would probably mean that China would have to exercise a larger authority within the WTO, and whether plan A or plan B, this necessitates some global rules to better discipline some of the Chinese trade practices, and notably in the area of subsidization. China, as a big player on the trade scene, still remains a sort of oddity, as long as 1/3 of its economy is still under state command. And this is a system that the coexistence of which with a sort of global open market capitalism necessitates a bit of attention. The reality is that the rules of WTO, as of today, are probably not totally fit for purpose, given the size, the speed and the force of China in the world economy. China joined the WTO many, many years ago now, and since then not much has changed. And there is a sort of discrepancy between rules which, for a variety of reasons, have remained unchanged, and the big changes in the world economy, notably brought by the rise of China. So this needs to be adjusted, and whether Plan A or Plan B, China has to become sort of more of a responsible stakeholder in the global trade system. EU doesn't have a problem with opening trade. EU has a social system that amortizes the consequences of trade opening a bit better than elsewhere. So I don't think EU will change tack. EU and US have been co-piloting the World Trade System since the GATT was created 70 years ago. EU will remain a big player, not least because it's one of the few areas where EU really is a union on the international scene. The rules of WTO have not substantially changed since it was established in 1994, which is many, many years ago, and that in the meantime the world has changed. And trade has changed, and the nature of obstacle to trade has changed. So there needs to be an adjustment so that the vocation of the WTO to play as a sort of a level playing field, preventing protectionist attitudes because people have good reason to believe that the rules of the game are reasonably fair, this needs some adjustments now. There's a Chinese issue there with subsidies, but it's not the only issue. I mean, many developing countries believe, for instance, that the US subsidization of agriculture is something that is not fair. There are areas like the digital economy, which is the sort of new frontier of economies, at least in many countries, who are not really dealt with by WTO rules, who were done at a time where the problem was obstacle to trade in textiles or steel or aluminium. The world of big data, the questions of whether the data are accessible, whether they are protected, whether they have to be localized, as they become a sort of essential raw material of the economy, these are areas where WTO needs to adjust. But of course, this can only be done if the members of WTO, which are the legislators in WTO, which are the ones that agree as the rules, agree to do that. And for that, you need this US-China tension to ease. I think what so far has hampered progress, I mean, there are many reasons, but the main one, I think, is that the WTO was constructed at a time where you had a developed country on the one side and developing country on the other side. And the rule was that developed countries would open trade between themselves with a sort of reciprocity principle, and that as developing countries were weaker, they were entitled to a sort of asymmetry. They would have to open trade less than bigger, stronger countries, which were developed countries. Now, that was the world of the 80s. This has changed. whether China is a developing country or a developed country is a matter of judgment. I mean, I know the Chinese view that China is a developing country. I also know the view of many of the Westerners who believe that it's a very strong developing country, and it looks very much like a developed country. And you know, whether China is what the Chinese say, a poor country with many rich, or what the US say, a rich country with many poor, makes a difference. So we need something which is more in between than in the past, notably for emerging countries, and notably for China, which is the biggest example, but you know, India probably to come, some Latin American countries probably to come, and later Africa probably to come. So we need to adjust this vision, which probably was okay 40 years ago, which is not okay now, that you are either developed or developing. Emerging countries, by definition, are developing countries who are becoming developed countries, and this has a lot of consequences on the trade regime, which I think need to be accepted. It's always imprudent to give advice to one's successor. And I think the role of the DG of WTO is to propose a way out of the present crisis in order to keep as many as WTO members possible around the table and address. And, you know, I mean, it's listening to the problems US have, EU has, Africa has, China has. They all have a problem. They now agree that WTO should be reformed, which is a good thing, although what you put in this reform may be quite different. So we've, I think, reached a step forward, which is this discussion is now open, and there is no precondition to open it. The G20 opened the discussion, so the box is open. The question now is, what do you put in that box? And I wouldn't advise to spend too much time in this sort of scoping exercise. We know there are 2 or 3 or 4 issues that need to be addressed short term.